Stay there. Sorry, it was crazy getting here today. It's fine.
Hi!
Aww. Oh my goodness. Hi. Oh, did you have a good day? You had fun today? How was he today?
Oh, he was wonderful.
Oh,
he was.
Good.
What did we say, buddy? We say thank you so much.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right.
See you
We'll see you tomorrow. All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye. It's okay.
Hi, I'm Patty Fitzgerald. I'm joined today by the writer-director of Tomorrow, Karis Campbell, and executive producer, Paul Howard. We're going to unpack some of the elements that we've seen just now and talk to you about not only some prevention education wisdom and tips for parents, and also some resources if you or someone you care about has also been a victim of child abuse.
I had the great pleasure of taking one of Patty's workshops, which is how I got introduced to her, and I'm so incredibly happy to be adding your voice to this conversation. I think what you do with your work is incredibly important. When screening this film, we did end up creating a space, a really safe space, I think, for a lot of people to disclose. And we were surprised by the volume of people who shared their stories with us, from strangers to people that we had existing relationships with. And I'm really grateful we were able to create something that was powerful enough and striking enough that people were able to have the opportunity to share about their own journey. The part of it that made me sad or regretful, and part of the impetus for creating this structure around the film, was the number of parents who I really sensed were paralyzed with fear after watching it. They found it incredibly triggering, but they were left with this feeling of dread. I live in a world where I'm dependent on childcare to solve the logistical challenges of my life and balancing work and life. What do I do? And how do I mitigate these traumas from occurring? How do I protect my children? The resources that you're offering parents are invaluable, and I really wanted to be part of us sharing this film, is being able to give that gift to parents so that they could walk away feeling empowered as parents and also having tools to be able to empower their children. Thank you for being part of this today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to collaborate. It's a huge honor. Karis, there's a very specific look and palette, and the film is beautifully shot. So can you tell us more about the style and how you chose to capture this story visually?
We were telling a story in a really short period of time, so the visual component was really important, and we wanted people to find it incredibly appealing, and so the inclination for them to lean in instantly was really a key part to telling the story. We live in a really visual world, and with social media, the ubiquity of these very carefully and thoughtfully curated narratives is something we've all grown quite accustomed to. And so I wanted to be able to leverage that into creating a story that would be, the experience for an audience would be comparable to that. Right. They would lean in, they would start making up bits and pieces from the visual information they were getting.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful film, and it's also visually very beautiful.
Thank you.
One of the things that Karis said very early on was that she wanted it to feel like Instagram. So if you were scrolling, and I think that's a great analogy for the film, because you get just kind of a surface level, but there's so much more to a person's life, obviously, than what they put onto Instagram. So I've always liked that analogy as part of, you know, the magic of how Tomorrow comes off.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. I read once that we deduce more about an object or a subject based on its surroundings than we do from the visual information we take from the object or subject on its own. And I think that that's such an interesting thing to examine when it comes to context and these assumptive leaps that we make when we are just taking little bits of information and then filling in those gaps.
What's the inspiration?
As a mom, I felt like it's really important as parents for us to re-examine how we talk to our children about this subject matter. I grew up in a time where the default was this stranger danger narrative, and I just have recognized more and more with my exposure to people who sadly experience this kind of abuse or trauma as children, that they weren't prepared for the fact that it could be perpetrated by somebody that they're close to, that they know and trust.
Statistically, 90% of abusers are people in a family's inner circle. And so we've gotten so used to that, don't talk to strangers, that we're not arming children with the right words and language and even the right feelings and empowerment to let somebody else know when things don't feel right with their caretaker.
And often people are shocked by the fact that it is a coach, a parent. And so I think that speaks to what you're saying, that there's a sense, even just in the media and society, that it's about focusing on the extremes as opposed to what is normal.
Right. I found in my work that most of the time people just sort of block that out, and it's just easier to think, well, it's just a stranger.
When your grandparent or when your teacher or your coach has crossed a line and there's a boundary violation, I think the person experiencing that boundary violation is much more likely to internalize responsibility for that.
Exactly.
I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't told to expect this, so I
Right.
must have done something wrong. That's such a critically important part of this, is for us to openly dialogue with our kids. It's certainly done that for our family. I've had a lot of much more open conversations with my kids through this process. And I think it just makes us feel like there's an open line of communication so that they do feel a freedom to disclose about things to whatever degree the violation has occurred.
Right.
And that to me is also really important.
Even something small that is uncomfortable and doesn't feel right, when it's coming from somebody in your inner circle, that's so hard for a child to disclose, and sometimes for a parent to even hear it if a child is trying to disclose. When I talked to both of you earlier, one of the things that you also mentioned was not only this secrecy or this shame that children often feel, but also the fact that a lot of times, if a child's very young, they don't even realize they're being abused. And so what happens is, very often a child doesn't disclose until they're much older, because at 8 years old, they just thought this is how kids get treated by people.
And they default to what an adult says. I think universally that's what children do. And so it doesn't matter who the adult is. And if that adult is a predator, they can manipulate the child. So yeah, absolutely. Right. If parents are then talking to their children about specific, what is your comfortability, and this is your body, and ownership, and all those things, much of what you talk about, that's gonna help begin the process in protecting kids.
One of the things I talk about a lot with parents is to remind kids to listen to that uh-oh feeling. It's an easy way to get them talking, and it doesn't sound like, what happened? Tell me what happened today.
Exactly what you're saying is enabling them to have access to that and being able to communicate about it. Let us work that out together. There doesn't have to be a logical reason for it. If you have an unsettled feeling, communicate that with us, and then we can unpack that together. That's not something you need to be doing on your own.
Right. Paul, I know there's a very personal aspect to this film for you. Would you be comfortable sharing that with us?
Of course. Karis and I have been friends for a long time, and over that time I had discussed my childhood and my past with her, and it ends up being some of the inspiration for the film. When I was young, my parents had to return to work. She wanted to find a daycare for me. I was in that daycare from 6 months old to about 12 years old. And unfortunately for me and the children there, it was a very violent environment. All of the children, including myself and my brother who also attended, were violently abused in a plethora of ways. It was a culture of fear. I describe it that way often because you buy into the environment. For me, because I was so young, I didn't really have a reference to anything different. There were no young children around me. The abuse and the activities that I saw were normal for me in that environment, and it was all I can remember. There was never a time that it started. It was always kind of the world that I lived in. When I did leave at 12, I can say that fairly quickly I had a sense that something was off. One of the stories, and I've shared this with Karis, is I was in a restaurant with my parents. This again is, now I've left the environment, I'm probably 13 or 14, and I see a kid, a young child, an infant, crying like at a table next to us. And I remember distinctly thinking, why don't they hit it to shut it up? And I share that story, it's jarring, it's uncomfortable, it's not a great story, but I share it as like an honest reflection of what abuse does and the insidious nature of it, because I questioned it. I mean, for me asking the question, there was clearly some concern, like, is that the right way? But I did not come to a conclusion. I did not go, no, you shouldn't hit kids. I thought, and it was only, many, many years later that you begin to, I went through therapy and various other avenues to kind of start to deal with it. I use that as an illustration and how you wouldn't know any different if that's the environment that you're from.
Right. I think that to be able to talk about your own experiences is so important, not only for your processing and recovery, but also for other people who maybe haven't gotten the help or the therapy or come to terms with it the way you have. So, I really, really appreciate that you're so open and honest about this. I can imagine it's still not easy.
Thank you. Yeah, it can be challenging. I'm in a great place now. It's been cathartic for me, but one of the things from the get-go when Karis was first talking about doing the film was how I felt about it. And I think really my main concern was that it become a tool for others, that it's something that can inspire people, whether it be through education or giving a voice to those who have maybe not yet dealt with their past or their situation. Right. And so what we're doing today, I'm so excited about, because this is the fruition of the film. We get to really dig into the themes that are important to me personally as a man and as a survivor of abuse.
That's what I wanted to comment on. I really love something you said a few minutes ago, that you're in a really good place now. And I think that's important so that other people who may have experienced this understand that this doesn't have to color who you are for the rest of your life and determine all the choices and decisions you make, and that you can be in a good place. Certainly not to minimize any of the abuse, but that there's healing, that there is healing. And so I don't want to say the poster child for that, but it's a really nice thing for others to see. Oh, yeah.
I'm of the mindset communication is key. That's why one of the reasons Karis and I get along so well is we believe in communicating, articulately telling our feelings, discussing, asking questions, engaging. And I think as a society, we could do a bit more of that. And so if I can be a symbol to people as a man also, I think that's another subject that we don't tend to think of men as victims. We think of boys and girls and women as being victims, but we don't think of what happens to a full-grown man.
Yeah. I feel like you bring a lot of hope to the subject. The fact that you are, healing and recovered from some pretty traumatic experiences, I think that it's really wonderful to show that there's light at the end of the tunnel, to show that there's hope. So I'm really grateful for your story and for you to share that.
Having been friends for long enough to have seen the evolutionary process for Paul and his personal development. I mean, I'm so proud of him as a friend, the amount that he's grown over the years, and had to really confront some painful truths and lean into unpacking and unraveling the complexity of the trauma he experienced. It's a very brave thing to do. And absolutely. I think the biggest healing that I've seen in people is the first step is to be able to talk about it. Brene Brown is somebody I'm a big fan of, and The Gift of Imperfection says shame hates when we tell our stories.
Yep.
Shame loves secrecy.
Yes.
And I think that that's something that most abusers, they take full advantage of that reality.
Yeah, they count on that.
Absolutely. Having somebody have the courage to disclose and not bear that burden on their own and suffer in silence, having the courage to understand and talk through what occurred. And I think it's critically important to have professionals as part of your team. Friends and family are such an important source of support and certainly can be for people. But I think these are very complicated issues, as we've discussed before.
Absolutely.
Especially when it's perpetrated by someone that you have a intimate relationship with or a loving relationship with. It's so tangled. And I think to have a professional who has the skill set to help you untangle something that's as complex as this is, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. So, Karis, learning that this is not a fiction story, but rather something very close to you and to one of your best friends, how did that affect you in creating the film?
I think it affected a lot of elements of it. I was incredibly protective of my friend since I knew, his story was the inspiration for this. I wanted to be really reverent throughout the process, and there was a lot of touching base through all the development of the project to make sure that he felt safe, the level of disclosure or his connection to the piece that he was really driving, how much he disclosed when we had screenings, because I think it's really critically important when we hold space for somebody who has the courage to come forward with their story, that we are very respectful about that. Absolutely. And I think it's an important thing for anybody who's experienced trauma to recognize that not everybody has the right to your story. So to find a safe space to disclose, I think is really important. And to tell the story in a way that was certainly inspired by Paul's experience, but we kept trying to remind ourselves this was not his story. Right. And I think that was important too, to make that distinction throughout the creative process.
One of the things I hear all the time from parents after they've learned that their child's been abused is, why didn't they tell me? How could I not have known? Why didn't they speak up? I've told my child, you can tell me anything. Disclosures usually don't come until at least 5 to 10 years after the child has been abused.
That statistic is accurate in my case. It is about 10 years. As I said, I was in 7th grade when I left, so I began processing and questioning things, but then high school kind of happens, and a couple of years of college before I really started. I actually had a deep depression where I couldn't get out of bed, was sleeping 17 hours a day, and was literally in bed that amount of time. And only when I started doing therapy did I really process. But that was about 10 years after leaving the environment, because again, the confusion is it's not when it happens, it's when you have left that environment, in my case. So how could you have clarity until you weren't in that environment? So that statistic is very apt for me. One of the things that I think Tomorrow as a film does really well is there is a beautiful, fun, light side to the environment. And that maybe is the thing that is most challenging for people who have no reference to it. It wasn't all bad. The idea that I would walk through the door and it would be nonstop torture is not the situation. Therein lies the issue. It is complicated, especially for a child to navigate, because I loved my abuser in many ways and was conflicted with that for many, many years. That was probably the most challenging part of therapy, was to go, no, you did not love. There was never love. Right. The danger is that it isn't black and white. It isn't on or off. Right. It is something that's gray. Right. And I think that is what becomes really difficult for children to navigate, but also for adults or non-survivors to understand. Exactly. And that's something I think that Tomorrow does really well on a subliminal level. There is goodness in it. There is warmth and connection and joy. And those things may be real for either party, because life isn't black and white.
The notion of appearances and how somebody presents themselves versus what's actually happening behind closed doors. And thematically, that was something I really wanted to explore in this project. When the mother comes in at the very end and you understand the context and what's actually happening, the caregiver closes a pocket door, closes off a section of the home. All of the intimacy boundary violations happened beyond that threshold. And that was a really important thing to me to build in, that we had this symbolic presentation of how it can be hard to recognize it because there's this duality that happens. For the mother coming into that space, the space that the mother was exposed to was this idyllic play area, something that looks straight out of a children's furniture catalog. I would feel really confident leaving my kid in a home that was clean, that was designed for their best interest and their pleasure. I had no idea my child was going into a bathtub with a caregiver,
Right.
having intimate physical engagement that was
Right.
wildly inappropriate. So having that kind of symbolic juxtaposition was really important.
When that door closes, we sort of shut off that part of the house, it's a very subtle reminder of exactly how a predator operates. You really do have to watch it a few times.
Yeah,
And then you start looking at things, you're like, wow, I missed that the first time. I think that's something very powerful about your film.
We expected that a lot of people would watch it, feel surprised at the end, and sort of questioning what they had just seen, and had an automatic impulse to want to view it again.
Right.
And then they're viewing it, like you said, with a new lens.
Right.
That they would start to notice there were things that they had missed, that they had omitted certain really critical information that would have painted a fuller picture. And because they had made a decision about what they were looking at, they suddenly ignored all that other information.
Right.
And the things we leave out when we're making calculations.
Right, right. I think that's an important thing, is what parents see on the outside often colors what they think about everything else, about the decisions that they make. In watching Tomorrow, we first look at the film and we look at it through one lens and what we think we're seeing. And then after this conversation, you go back and you look at Tomorrow again, you really do see some indicators that something's not quite right here. One of the prevention techniques I have for parents is just common sense talking to your child, but getting information from them rather than saying, how was your day at the caretakers today? And your kid goes, fine. Did you have fun? Yeah. Rather than do that, I think it's important that parents get a dialogue going. And so one of the tips I give parents is start talking about, tell me 3 things that you did at the caretakers, and I'm going to tell you 3 things I did at work. So it becomes this way for sharing, and in that way, sometimes a child will disclose or give the parent a hint that something's not quite right, and that I have to pay more attention to that, or maybe I need to take a different action, or maybe we need to pull my kid out of this daycare.
I think one of the things that was later for me that saved me was I did have that relationship in my family, and so we always had dinners where we talked about the day, and that's when it started coming out, where little bits. Now, obviously this was much later, but because I felt safe, because that was a normal thing in my family, my brother and me started disclosing things, and my mom would be like, oh, tell me, just trying to be listening to us. But had I not done that, I don't know if I would have gotten to the point with therapy. So I love that advice.
I think that's so important, and different families do it in different ways.
Another thing I read recently, which I think is so great as a parent that touches on what you were saying, is, do I have enough information to have a reaction yet? And I think it's the tell me more part of, rather than, because it's hard as a parent, you hear something that's alarming and it's difficult to conceal that natural response. But I think what you're saying is so important, that could lead to a child shutting down and not feeling comfortable disclosing.
Definitely, exactly,
so that's
yes.
great.
And so saying something as simple as, wow, tell me more. Wow, I didn't know that, is a huge difference between that and, oh my God, you took a bath that's a little weird.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think the style of communication with the parents is really key.
That was something I think is really powerful about Tomorrow, is it challenges the viewer to say, well, I let it slide on this because I thought it was the mom. And now that I found out it's not the mom, I have problems with it. And that, I think, is a larger subject for society. It's like, why? Because as we've talked about, and as is the statistic at the end of the film, 90% of abused children know their abuser. So we have to not be afraid, but move forward with that knowledge.
Kids tell us a lot without any words at all. Kids will tell us, watch their body language and how they respond or don't respond. Watch when your child really doesn't want to be around somebody, or really sort of shies away or recoils from someone.
All the children are staring at the door as you walk in, are quiet and silent. I mean, those are not normal behaviors.
That was something that you had shared with me that had really resonated. And we captured a moment of this when we were shooting, of the kids would be staring at the door in anticipation, just waiting. And Paul had said something that was gut-wrenching to me. He said, you learn to recognize your parents' knock. And just like that would spell freedom, that I would be then taken out. And when we were shooting it, it was an interesting thing. The child kept nestling their head and not wanting to make eye contact with the caregiver as we were leaving. And that to me was really important. There was no referencing back except for a sense of relief once we were outside of the environment. Was like, great, I'm done. And a child at that age doesn't understand the implications necessarily of I'm going back here tomorrow, but I'm free tonight. I'm out of that environment tonight, and the sense of relief that was associated with that. The title of the film was really, as we touched on before, you know, there's many layers to it, but it was this notion of you become dependent on an environment or a caregiving situation that is endless tomorrows of that child being exposed to that dangerous environment, that usually things happen in an incremental way. So it may be fairly benign to begin with and then continues to evolve, because people, that's human nature, right? We push to a line, we cross that line, we push a little further, we cross another line. So that was a really important thing thematically. And also the tomorrows being, this is something that will linger, the residual effect of having this kind of trauma will linger with this child for endless tomorrows, unless they're able to get the help and support that they need to process it.
If anyone is on the journey or beginning their journey, it can be challenging, it can be exhausting and scary, but it's totally worth it. I can speak from experience that I am better because I went through this journey, and more aware, a happier person, and now able to do projects like this where I can engage people. If you have some concerns or were triggered by anything in this film or that we've been discussing, I think I would encourage you to seek help, talk to somebody, check the links in the body of the video if you need some good resources, and reach out and take those first steps.